"We don't want a crying child in first class." The words sliced through the VIP lounge's hushed atmosphere like a blade of ice. The mother's fingers tightened around her son's small hand, her exhausted face a canvas of desperation and dignity. Around them, the airport's elite waiting area fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the gentle hum of distant jet engines and the subtle clicking of phones as passengers pretended not to notice the unfolding drama. The boy, no more than 5, pressed closer to his mother's leg, sensing the hostility radiating from the man in the expensive suit. The evening sun streamed through the panoramic windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors of the exclusive lounge. The mother's wrinkled boarding passes trembled in her free hand, tickets she'd saved months to purchase. Across from her, the airline staff shifted uncomfortably, their practiced customer service smiles straining as they glanced between her and the glowering businessman who demanded her removal. In the corner, a figure in a worn leather jacket lowered his phone, his weathered face hardening as he observed the scene with increasing intensity. The businessman's voice grew louder, each word dripping with entitled confidence. "I paid for a peaceful first-class experience, not a nursery." Other passengers stirred, some nodding in quiet agreement, others finding sudden interest in their devices. What they didn't notice was how the man in the leather jacket had stopped scrolling through his phone, how his expression had shifted from casual observation to focused attention. Tom Hardy's jaw clenched slightly as he watched the mother blink back tears, her son's small face buried in her side. The VIP lounge had always been a stage for subtle power plays, but tonight's performance was anything but subtle. The businessman, Michael Woods, according to his loudly declared credentials, stood with the practiced posture of someone accustomed to getting his way. His Italian suit probably cost more than the mother's entire trip, a fact he seemed intent on emphasizing with every gesture. The airline staff's faces had taken on that particular expression, unique to service workers caught between protocol and conscience, their eyes darting between computer screens and the increasingly tense scene before them. The mother, Sarah Chen, had been traveling for 18 hours already. Her son, Timothy's small dinosaur backpack, covered in cheerful stickers and carrying his vital medications, hung limply from her shoulder. The boy himself hadn't made a sound since the confrontation began, a detail that seemed lost on those casting disapproving glances their way. His tiny hand clutched his mother's skirt, knuckles white with tension as he tried to make himself invisible against her leg. The medication that kept his chronic condition under control was waiting at their destination, a detail she'd been trying to explain before Woods cut her off with another loud complaint about his premium experience. "Look," Woods continued, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "I didn't get where I am by letting other people's problems become my problems." He adjusted his Rolex with practiced nonchalance, the watch catching the evening light streaming through the panoramic windows. "If you can't afford proper arrangements for your situation," he gestured dismissively at Timothy, "perhaps you should consider alternate modes of transportation." The lounge had grown unnaturally quiet, that specific kind of silence that falls when witnesses to cruelty try to convince themselves they're not really there. A young woman behind her laptop had stopped typing mid-sentence, her fingers hovering over the keys. An elderly couple exchanged uncomfortable glances over their tablets. The airline staff, led by a manager named Preston, according to his badge, seemed to be searching their computer screens for a solution that wouldn't offend the wrong person. Tom Hardy's fingers had stopped drumming against his armrest. He'd been observing the scene with increasing intensity, his expression darkening with each passing moment. The character he was currently filming, another tough guy role his agent had pushed, felt very far away from the cold fury building in his chest. Sarah Chen's voice remained steady, though her hands shook slightly as she pulled out her phone. I can show you the medical documentation again. My son needs—" Woods cut her off with an imperious wave of his hand, the gesture so dismissive it made several onlookers wince. "I don't need to see your documentation. I need you to understand that my comfort isn't negotiable. Preston," he turned to the manager, "I'm sure there must be another flight for these people." The way he said "these people" made something shift in the atmosphere of the lounge. A businessman in the corner closed his laptop with a sharp click. The elderly woman who had been pretending to read set down her book. And Tom Hardy, who had built a career playing men of few words but decisive action, stood up. The movement was subtle, but its effect was immediate. Heads turned, phones lowered. Even Woods, mid-tirade, faltered slightly as Hardy's solid frame emerged from the corner. There was something in his walk, a controlled power that needed no announcement, no declaration. The same presence that had commanded scenes in Warrior and Mad Max now filled the real-world stage of this airport lounge. Hardy's approach was unhurried, each step deliberate, his presence filling the space with the kind of quiet intensity that had become his trademark on screen. But this wasn't a movie set. This wasn't Alfie Solomon's intimidating rivals or Eddie Brock confronting criminals. This was Tom Hardy, the man, and somehow that made his presence even more compelling. "Mate," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive blend of London street and theatrical training, "I couldn't help but overhear." He stopped a few feet from Woods, hands relaxed at his sides, but his stance spoke volumes to anyone familiar with body language. The businessman's expression flickered between recognition and uncertainty, his carefully constructed dominance suddenly on shaky ground. The other passengers had abandoned all pretense of disinterest now. Phones were being raised, not even trying to be subtle anymore. The elderly couple who had been watching the scene unfold nudged each other, whispering behind their hands. The young woman behind her laptop had completely forgotten about her work, her screensaver now floating unnoticed. Timothy, still pressed against his mother's leg, peeked out with the first hint of curiosity he'd shown since the confrontation began. Hardy caught the boy's eye and gave him a slight wink, so quick most people missed it. But Sarah saw it, and something in her exhausted posture straightened just a bit. Woods, however, was already drawing himself up, preparing to reassert his authority in this situation. He clearly hadn't expected an audience with a celebrity, but he wasn't about to back down in front of one either. "Mr. Hardy," Woods said, stretching his lips into what he probably thought was a gracious smile, "I'm a huge fan of your work, but this is a private matter between me and the airline." He gestured toward his first-class ticket as if it were a royal decree. "I've paid for a certain level of service, and I have concerns about my flight experience being compromised." Hardy's response was a slight tilt of his head, the kind of movement that in his films often preceded someone learning a hard lesson. "Interesting choice of words there, mate. Compromised?" His voice remained conversational, but there was steel underneath it. "Let's talk about what's actually being compromised here." He turned slightly to include the whole lounge in the conversation, though his eyes never left Woods. "See, I've been sitting over there for the past 20 minutes, watching this young man." He nodded toward Timothy, who was now watching him with undisguised fascination. "Show more dignity and self-control than most adults I know. Haven't heard a peep from him, have we?" The question hung in the air, making several passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Meanwhile, the only person I've heard causing a disturbance is the one claiming to want peace and quiet. The airline staff had stopped pretending to check their computers. Preston, the manager, was watching the exchange with a mixture of relief and apprehension, clearly hoping someone else would make the difficult decision for him. Wood's face had taken on a dangerous shade of red, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Now see here," Wood sputtered, his composure fully cracking. "You don't understand the principle of the matter. I've worked very hard to afford—" Hardy's quiet laugh stopped him mid-sentence. It wasn't a mocking laugh, but rather one of genuine disbelief, and somehow that made it worse. "The principal?" Hardy repeated, and there was something in his tone that made everyone in the lounge lean forward slightly. "Let's talk about principals then." "This mother," he gestured to Sarah without taking his eyes off Woods, "has been explaining for the past 20 minutes that her son needs medical attention at their destination. Medical attention, mate. And your response was to try to bump them from their flight because what? Their existence might interrupt your gin and tonic?" The elderly woman who had been watching let out a quiet "oh" of approval. Someone in the back of the lounge started to clap, but quickly thought better of it. Timothy had fully emerged from behind his mother now, watching Hardy with the kind of pure admiration usually reserved for superheroes. "I don't appreciate your tone," Woods tried, but his voice had lost its authority. The other passengers were openly staring now, phones recording every moment. Sarah Chen stood straighter, one hand protectively on Timothy's shoulder, her exhaustion temporarily forgotten as she watched this unexpected ally champion their cause. Hardy took one step closer to Woods, and though he hadn't raised his voice or made any aggressive moves, the businessman involuntarily took a step back. "Well then," Hardy said, his voice carrying that quiet intensity that had made him famous, "let's talk about what you do and don't appreciate, shall we?" Hardy shifted his weight slightly, and despite his relaxed posture, there was something in his movement that reminded everyone present of his roles as both Bane and Tommy Conlon. "You know what I appreciate?" he continued, his voice carrying that quiet intensity that had silenced movie theaters worldwide. "I appreciate watching a young mom trying to keep her dignity while dealing with someone who thinks their wallet gives them the right to be cruel." The word cruel hung in the air like a thunderclap. Woods opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, but Hardy wasn't finished. He turned to address the whole lounge now, though his words were clearly aimed at one person. "See, I've played a lot of tough guys in my career. Fighters, gangsters, villains, people who use their strength to dominate others." He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the now silent room. "But the thing about real strength? Real power?" His gaze locked back onto Woods. "It's not about how much you can take from others. It's about how you treat people who need your help." Preston, the airline manager, had stopped pretending to check his computer. The young woman behind her laptop was openly filming now, her forgotten coffee growing cold beside her. Sarah Chen stood tall, her exhaustion temporarily forgotten as she watched this unexpected champion defend not just her rights, but her dignity. Timothy's grip on her skirt had loosened, his eyes wide with wonder as he watched the scene unfold. "I've sat in first class plenty of times," Hardy continued, his voice carrying a hint of that Alfie Solomon steel beneath its casual tone. "And you know what I've noticed? The truly classy ones, the ones who actually deserve to be there, they're the ones helping the mum with her baby stroller. They're the ones offering their blanket to the elderly passenger who's cold. They're not the ones throwing their status around like a weapon." Wood's face had gone from red to white, his expensive suit suddenly seeming to hang awkwardly on his frame. The other passengers were nodding now, some openly, others just slightly, but the shift in the room was palpable. A businessman in the corner had quietly closed his laptop and was watching with unmasked admiration. The elderly couple had moved closer, as if physically aligning themselves with Hardy's position. "So here's what's going to happen," Hardy said, taking another casual step forward. His movement was relaxed, but there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. "This young man and his mum are going to board their flight as planned. They're going to get the medical attention they need at their destination." He paused, his eyes never leaving Woods. "And you're going to have a think about what real class looks like. Because, mate," he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Right now, the only person compromising anyone's flight experience is you. The lounge had fallen completely silent, every phone, every camera, every pair of eyes focused on this moment. Even the distant sound of jet engines seemed to have faded into the background. Woods looked around the lounge, searching for support and finding none. The carefully constructed facade of superiority crumbled as he realized every face in the room had turned against him. Even Preston, the airline manager, had straightened his spine and was now looking at Woods with barely concealed disapproval. I didn't mean to. Woods started, but his words trailed off as Hardy raised an eyebrow. The same expression that had intimidated countless on-screen opponents now served a higher purpose. Timothy, still holding his mother's hand, gave Hardy a small, shy smile, the first he'd shown since the confrontation began. "Preston," Hardy said, turning to the manager with a warmth that had been notably absent from his interaction with Woods, "I believe Ms. Chen and her son have a flight to catch, and I'd be happy to switch my seat if they need any accommodation." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own first-class ticket, the gesture drawing quiet murmurs of approval from the onlookers. Sarah Chen's eyes welled with tears, but these were different from the ones she'd been holding back earlier. "Mr. Hardy, you don't have to," she began, but he shook his head with a gentle smile. "The pleasure's mine. Besides," he winked at Timothy, who was now beaming, "I reckon your young man here would make a far better seatmate than some people." The pointed comment wasn't lost on Woods, who had suddenly become very interested in his phone, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. Around the lounge, phones captured every moment, but this wasn't just about viral content anymore. This was about witnessing real strength in action. The aftermath of Hardy's intervention transformed the VIP lounge. Where there had been uncomfortable silence, there was now a warm buzz of conversation. The elderly couple approached Sarah with offers to help with her bags. The young woman with the laptop closed her recording and came over to share her own story of traveling with a sick child. Even Preston, the airline manager, seemed to have found his backbone, efficiently arranging for priority boarding for Sarah and Timothy. Woods had retreated to a corner, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in hushed tones about switching to another flight. No one paid him any attention anymore. The power he'd wielded so confidently earlier had evaporated like morning mist under the sun. Hardy's presence had not just resolved a conflict, it had reminded everyone present of their own capacity for kindness. Timothy, still clutching his dinosaur backpack, looked up at Hardy with unabashed admiration. "Mum says you fight bad guys in movies," he said softly, his first words since the confrontation began. Hardy crouched down to the boy's level, his tough guy persona melting into a gentle smile. "Yeah, mate, sometimes I do," Hardy replied to Timothy, his voice gentle. "But you know what? The real heroes are the ones who stay strong even when things are tough, like you and your mum today." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the kind actors use for script notes. "How about we take a proper picture together? Something better than those secret videos everyone's been taking." The lounge erupted in embarrassed laughter as phones were quickly lowered. Sarah watched, tears threatening again, as Hardy spent several minutes drawing a small cartoon dinosaur next to his autograph, asking Timothy detailed questions about his favorite prehistoric creatures. The boy's answers grew more animated with each response, his earlier fear forgotten in the excitement of meeting someone who took him seriously. The social media posts were already spreading through the internet like wildfire, but they missed the best part, the quiet conversation between a movie star and a little boy about the difference between velociraptors and T-Rexes, while a mother watched her son transform from a frightened child back into the enthusiastic boy she knew. As the boarding call echoed through the lounge, Hardy helped Sarah organize their carry-on bags, waving off her continued thanks with characteristic humility. "Just promise me one thing," he said, handing Timothy his backpack. "Keep learning about those dinosaurs. World needs more experts." The boy's answering smile could have lit up the entire airport. The videos would go viral within hours, gaining millions of views and shares. Celebrity news sites would praise Hardy's intervention. Social media would explode with comments about real heroes, and countless posts would analyze the power dynamics of the confrontation. But they'd miss the most important part: the quiet aftermath, where a small act of kindness had reminded an entire room full of privileged travelers about what truly mattered. As Sarah and Timothy walked toward their gate, now accompanied by the elderly couple who'd insisted on helping with their bags, Hardy watched them go with a satisfied nod. The young woman with the laptop caught his eye and smiled. "That was better than any movie scene," she said softly. Hardy shrugged, his lips quirking in that familiar half-smile. "Nah," he replied, "just a reminder that sometimes the best roles are the ones we play in real life.